Hi there and welcome back to my channel. My name is Marianne, and in this tutorial, I will be walking you through how to paint these beautiful misty marsh scenes in acrylic paint using only 4 colors. I absolutely love painting in sketchbooks and know you will too. And if you'd like to follow along, I've made my reference photos available as a free download through the link in the description below. Let's get started. To paint along with me, you'll need a limited palette of titanium white, burnt umber, cadmium yellow light, and ultramarine blue. I like to set my paints on a wet palette, which I make by adding 2 or 3 layers of paper towel to an artist butcher's tray before dampening the paper towel with water and laying a piece of wax paper on top. This keeps my paints workable for hours. To start the painting, tape off the edges of your sketchbook using a delicate strength painter's tape. This can be peeled off easily and creates a nice crisp border while preventing the pages from buckling. For my sketchbook, I'm using the Strathmore 400 series watercolor book, which has cold press paper and can handle the heavy weight of acrylics. I'm also a big fan of the Stillman & Birn Zeta series, which has heavyweight hot press paper and a smoother texture. Once the pages are completely taped up, I like to use gesso as a primer, as I find it helps to slow the absorption of the paint by the paper. Squirt it all over the page and spread it out with a foam brush. Careful not to leave any ridges, as they'll remain visible even under the painting. I visited this marsh back in the early winter and was completely stunned by the mist that left frost on the tips of the marsh grass and knew I just had to paint it. Once the gesso is fully dry, I like to give it a quick sanding. I do this on all of my canvases as well as paper to smooth out any grittiness. This allows your brushes to glide. Now I'd like to let you in on my secret to mixing colors. I like to use tones as the basis of all my color mixing. Tones are grays ranging from light to dark, which I mix by using a combination of burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. Burnt umber has a reddish orangey base, so if you use more burnt umber than ultramarine, you wind up with warm, purplish tones. If you use more ultramarine, you wind up with cooler, blue-based grays. From here, we can use color theory to help us figure out how to mix the colors we'll need for this wintry scene. When you look at the sky in the reference photo, it has almost a greenish undertone to it, so we'll add some yellow into this mixture. Not much, just enough to tint the tone that we've mixed. If your tone is too green, add some burnt umber. If it's too red, add more yellow and blue. If it's too dark, add more titanium white. Now it's time to get painting. For my horizon line, I like to measure it out using tape, a mechanical pencil, and a ruler to ensure that I can blend and swirl in my sky without losing that very important line. Next, let's add in that beautiful gray-green sky tone we mixed on our palettes where we see it in the reference photo. To create the effect of a misty background, mix a tone that is only ever so slightly darker than the sky and dab that in. A general rule for landscapes is that the farther away something is, the less contrast it has, and the more bluish gray it appears. The closer an object is, the more contrast you see, and it's generally warmer. So while I'm layering in these trees, I'm mindful of the fact that my eye will pick up on the subtle difference between the sky and background, and I use colors that are barely different from each other to create the effect of mist. I also use a technique called dry brushing, where you use very little paint and scuff and swirl it over previous layers to create a foggy effect. Next, we'll add in some hints of color to the trees in the left background. All you need to do is add a little more yellow to your gray tone to make it seem more golden, and a little more blue and yellow to create green. Look at how these little changes of color when added to the tone create this lovely, soft effect. Before we add in the water, let's roughly sketch in the lines of the marsh grass. I like to use a lighter color to do this, a burnt umber tone with a paler value that would be easier to cover up if I make a mistake. Remember that this is just a sketch, and even if your marsh grass lines don't match the reference photo exactly, that's perfectly okay. When doing a smooth blend with acrylic, I like to use 2 brushes and pre-mix my colors in advance. I'm using 2 large filbert brushes in this case. Once I have my 2 colors mixed, a lighter value and a darker one, I layer them both in and allow them to dry fully. I don't worry about blending them at this stage and just get them onto the page. Once they're fully dry, you can go ahead and blend between the 2 colors, switching between brushes as opposed to between colors to achieve a nice smooth blend. Full disclosure, I realized after I put the water in that I had made the color a bit too blue, so you're going to see me do a correction shortly. Once the water is fully dry, you can eliminate the remaining white paper on your page by adding in a dark base to build your next layer on. The grass in the bottom left is a darker, warmer brown, and the grass a little further away is toned to be paler, suggesting some distance. I also add in a few shadows that I can see in the reference photo to create depth in subsequent layers. Here's that color correction I was talking about. To reduce the blue, I mixed the 2 colors again, this time with a slightly greenish undertone that really reflected the colors in the sky. I was so much happier with this blend, and it really pulled the whole painting together. From there, it's second layer time, which is my favorite because we get to add in the details. I start by measuring the tree in the distance to ensure that the reflection is equal in height, and mark that in with my mechanical pencil. Then I dab in the reflection, again using a soft tone which implies mist. Now let's work from back to front using very soft brushwork with loose strokes to start, which, when combined with a toned back color, creates the perception of depth. Softly scuff in the shadows and the misty highlights, looking at shapes as opposed to creating individual pieces of grass. Keep building slowly and softly until you come to the midground and can finally pull out the detail brushes. The danger here, of course, is getting too detailed too quickly. Even though you're starting to suggest individual blades of grass, try squinting at your reference photo to keep your brushwork impressionist. You'll notice that sometimes I wipe away errors with a damp Q-tip. As long as the paint isn't fully dry but the paint underneath is, you can use a wet Q-tip as an eraser. I'll admit to being a little stumped for how to approach the grass in the foreground, but this is why I love sketchbooks, because I get the opportunity to practice and experiment. I knew I wanted to work from dark to light, so I first added in a scratchy layer of burnt umber. I also worked in the shadow in the water from the grass and some lily pads both in the foreground and the background. From there, I just kind of made it up as I went along. I would squint at my reference photo to try and figure out where colors were clustered as opposed to worrying about every individual blade of grass. And slowly, as the burnt umber was covered up, this haphazard approach seemed to be working. Just keep chopping in variations of color, using yellows, greens, and browns to break up the monotony of the undertone. To finish up the piece, I marked areas that I wanted to adjust or finish with a small piece of green painter's tape, which helps me keep track of areas that need a little love. I adjusted both the grass and the lily pads and added the reflection in on the mid-ground grass. A little tip that I use to help make my reflections pop is to add a thin line where the water meets the grass. Even though you don't see this in the reference photo, it helps the viewer understand the separation between object and water. I was thrilled with how this painting turned out, but let's keep going with the second painting showing a close-up of the marsh grass. I'm going to take this file folder that I've cut in half and place it over the painting that I've just finished to protect it while I'm working. The process for creating this second painting is almost identical to the first, starting with the sky and blocking in rough shapes for the tree line. The trees are roughly blotted in, with the tallest trees in the distance receiving the lightest value. I make them lighter and rougher than they appear in the reference photo. When you're working with a photo, it's important to remember that the camera captures details that aren't visible with the human eye, so you can soften the background and still maintain a realistic effect. When it's time to block in the marsh grass, I like to use a light, warm tone to place my grasses where I want them, since it's easier to cover them up if I make a mistake. Even though my composition is pretty close to the original photograph, don't feel like you have to include every single piece of grass that you can see in the image. Just because it's in the photo does not mean that you have to include it in the painting. To help pop the grass, we're going to add in some contrast with a dark, warm tone and break that up with some ultramarine based grays to suggest the snow. I found that it was helpful for me to roughly dab in these colors where I saw them fall in the photo, as opposed to trying to capture each and every individual tuft of grass or cluster of snow. To finish up our paintings, let's brighten up these lines with a pretty golden base tone. I mixed this using my regular gray tone, but I warmed it up with a bit more yellow and burnt umber. Then it's time to take the tape off and see how they look together as a set. And there you have it, the completed spread. Thank you so much for following along with this tutorial, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write me a comment below. You can follow me on all social networks and tag me in any artwork that you'd like me to look at, especially paintings inspired by my videos. You can also join my free Facebook Art Incubator support group through the link in the description below. Keep making your life beautiful, and I'll see you in the next video.